Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weep Union, and in this one we have several developments in favor of the Russians. The Russians have managed to advance in the northwestern parts of the Ukrainian coast in Kherson. The Russians have made several advances within the city of Tesk and in the direction of Pokrovsk. There's no additional updates due to the lack of updates from Deep State Map and other sources. It seems that the past few days have seen very intense fighting, and some of these have not yet come to an outcome due to the introduction of new reserves. At the same time, some very interesting developments are taking place in the Kherson direction, so we'll cover that as well. Starting out in the northern direction, the Russians have managed to capture the settlement of Kruklenkoe, with the geolocated footage south of the settlement along the main road towards Malaya Luknia here in the eastern direction, as well as the geolocated footage within the settlement itself. We see that the Russians have gained full control of it and are now pushing towards Malaya Luknia, which they are now less than 3 kilometers away from. There's no significant defenses or fortifications between the Russian positions and the Ukrainians, and with control over Kruklenkoe, as well as the forest lines to the north, the Russians will look to flank the settlements of Leonidivka and Alexandria of the Ukrainians to the southwest, and push towards Viktorovka here in the eastern direction, to then cut off the supply lines going in and out of Malaya Nuclear, and thereby actually encircle the entirety of the Ukrainian forces here in the northern direction. With the Russian capture of Naidenov in the eastern direction, they'll be able to advance along the forest lines and railways towards the east of Malaya Luknia, and with a push towards Malaya Luknia from the west, they'll be able to attack the settlement from the northern and western directions, from which they can cut off supplies going in and out of this pocket. This will encircle the entirety of the Ukrainian groupings north of this. The settlement of Malaya Luknia has fortified positions within it. One of the main ones is this prison here in the eastern parts of the settlement, which the Russians were able to hold on to for several weeks when the Ukrainians launched their offensive operations, from which, following the capture of Malaya Luknia, the following settlements fell one by one. Thereby, the Russians, if they manage to regain control over Malaya Luknia, they'll be able to push towards Luknia, here to the south and along the railways towards Sutsha, where the offensive operation will reach Sutsha, and the Russians will look to regain control over the main settlement here within the Kursk region. At the same time, it will allow them to continue the offensive operations along Svetlikova by gaining full control over the fortified positions to the north of the settlement and the settlements in that direction. Thereby, the Russians will have control over the river line and the main road towards Svetlikova, from which they can then push towards Sutsha. Therefore, the Russians are launching a significant push from the northern direction towards Sutsha, and in the eastern direction, there's been recent advances towards the settlements here in the northeastern direction, from which they can also push towards Sutsha. And with the capture of Plechovo and now fighting over Goevo and Kurilovka, the Russians are also looking to flank Sutsha from the southern direction. And based on all of that, the Russians are fighting over the Kursk region, and they're looking to regain full control of it within the next month or two is a realistic bet. Now, moving on towards the Tesk direction, there's several advances by the Russians. The Russians have advanced in the direction of Krimske, slightly larger than what I first mapped out. This is due to additional advances that the Russians have made in this direction towards the settlement and industrial zone, which remains the final stronghold of the Ukrainians in the city. The Russians have also advanced west of the industrial area in the southern parts of the city, from which the Russians are now advancing towards the next hill here within the city. This is to gain control over all of the high ground within the city. They're moving towards the western outskirts of the settlement, and thereby we see continuous offensive operations by the Russians within the city of Tesk to gain full control of it and bypass the Ukrainian defenses to the south of the city by moving towards Sherbenivka from the northern and southern directions through Neolodivka. In the Pokrovsk direction, there's been an advance by the Russians here as well. The Russians have managed to gain a foothold within Pishane and captured the first streets. With this, fighting is now reaching the settlements here to the southwest of Pokrovsk, which is the first of several villages that are connected to the southwestern outskirts of the city of Pokrovsk. With this, the Russians will look to gain control over fortified positions in the direction of Pokrovsk, moving through the residential area, and also gain a foothold within the city itself from two directions. We see heavy fighting in the Pokrovsk direction as well, and this geolocated footage confirms the advance of the Russians into Pishane. Moving on to the Kherson direction, there are some interesting developments here, mainly towards Kherson itself. We see this footage here of heavy bombing towards the city and the surrounding areas. There's a lot of artillery and a lot of FAB bombs landing on the Ukrainian positions near the city and the riverbank of the Dnieper River. At the same time, there is this very interesting fact, which is that the Ukrainians do not have a lot of soldiers and resources in the Kherson direction. That is a statement based on the militaryland.net deployment map, which is the most accurate map for Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainians have several brigades here in the Kherson direction, as well as regiments and battalions. The Ukrainians have a 122nd Defense Brigade, the 124th Territorial Defense Brigade, the 126th Territorial Defense Brigade. There's the 73rd Naval Center for Special Operations. There's the 121st Defense Brigade. There is the 11th Special Purpose Battalion of the 112th Territorial Defense Brigade. There's the 32nd Artillery Brigade, and there's the 406th Artillery Brigade. Several other smaller units across the area. Based on this, there's not a lot of forces by the Ukrainians, not more than 10,000 soldiers. Especially if you do not count the artillery units, which will mainly be support. And we also see that the majority of the forces is actually territorial defense. So these are less prioritized units in terms of training, manpower, equipment, and so on. Deep State map is in turn the most reliable for the location of Russian troops. Based on this, we see there's some Storm Z units, there's self-propelled artillery regiment, airborne assault regiment, there's Bars squads, a tank regiment, another motorized rifle regiment, airborne assault regiment, and 1822nd battalion, not sure what that is, 385th motorized rifle regiment. So a lot of infantry regiments and brigades in this section of the front line, numbering around 20,000 soldiers. Now, there's been talks about the Russians preparing a lot of stuff for a potential naval crossing, both in terms of pontoon bridges, boats, and everything else that is needed for such an operation. If we base that of the fact that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians in the area and they're able to relocate forces to the Kherson direction, especially if they redirect forces from the Zaporizhia direction, the Ukrainians in turn will not be able to concentrate as many forces because relocating forces to another section of the front line will weaken other sections of the front line. And if the Russians combine an assault somewhere else across the front line in the Sumy or Chernihiv regions, then the Ukrainians would have to choose between several fronts. So what I'm saying and what I'm getting to is that there is the possibility that the Russians are planning an offensive operation in the Kherson direction, especially if they plan on gaining full control over the annexed regions prior to Trump's inauguration on the 20th of January. However, that is simply a goal which was stated by Zelensky. Instead, what we do see is that the Russian new defense minister Belousov has said a week ago that Russia plans to achieve victory in the war and the goals announced by Putin in 2025. That means they plan on actually finishing the war in 2025, where they gain full control over everything that they've claimed that they want to gain control of, which means all of the regions here marked with the dark blue color. The remaining parts of the Donetsk region, the remaining parts of the Zaporizhia region, and the remaining parts of the Kherson region. That means in 2025, we'll either see a Russian attempt to cross the river line and gain full control over the Kherson region, or that we will see that the Russians will negotiate a peace deal with Ukraine where they achieve that based on his statement. To achieve that goal of gaining full control over all four regions in 2025, the Russians will need to advance an average of 60 square kilometers a day, which is double the current rate at which they are advancing. Either that needs to be achieved, or a new large-scale offensive similar to what we saw at the start of the war the Russians would have to pull out such an operation if they want to succeed with such aspirations. At the same time, advancing through these fortified positions does not really make sense, especially if the Russians gain full control over the Donetsk region. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will bypass those defenses and go for Dnipro city instead, from which they can either negotiate a deal Dnipro for Kherson, or simply use the Dnipro region and Zaporizhia regions to then push through the Dnipro River from those directions to avoid a river crossing, or they can plan a river crossing and push towards Mykolaiv, Odessa, and so on. In either case, the Russians have not gone away from achieving what they announced they wanted to achieve in the Ukraine war, and there's no reason to believe that this war will end without the Russians fighting over these areas. The fact that the Russians would have to fight over major cities such as Zaporizhia, Kherson, and so on to gain full control of these areas, as well as the Kramatorsk-Konstantinivka line, all indicates that the Russians are planning a large-scale offensive in 2025. Therefore, 2025 will be extremely decisive for this war. It will determine whether the Russians will be able to successfully launch a large-scale offensive. Where will it be launched from? How will it take place? What is the actual objective of the Russians? Do they plan on only taking these 4 regions that they've already annexed, or do they plan on taking more than that? Whichever the case, it is likely that the Russians will be stepping up offensive operations already now and all the way until this war ends, and you'll see an intensification and escalation of the conflict this period of time. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.